So why isn't this just a raw meritocracy, academics only, like England or China?
Because there's 25,000 high schools, and if it was academics only and you only admitted valedictorians at each of the 25,000 high schools, there still would not be enough spots for all of them at the T10.
Hello, and welcome to the Admittedly podcast. My name is Thomas Caleel. I'm the former director of MBA admissions and financial aid for my alma mater, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. In this podcast, I don't promise easy answers or quick fixes, but I will use my decades of experience to help you achieve your education goals. Now let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Admittedly podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Caleel. Today we're going to pull back the curtain on how selective admissions officers are actually trained to think and what that means for students trying to position themselves strategically in an increasingly competitive landscape. Joining me today is Sonam, Admittedly's own Interim Director of College Counseling and a former Senior Admissions Officer at Duke University. Over the course of her career, Sonam has reviewed more than 10,000 applications and worked with students from nearly every angle of the admissions process, inside a top university admissions office, in high schools, and in community-based organizations. She holds a BA from Duke and an MBA from Rice, and she brings more than a decade of experience helping ambitious students understand how institutions evaluate applications and how to build a coherent, strategic profile. Today, we're going to talk about how admissions officers are trained to evaluate candidates, how institutional priorities shape decisions, the return of standardized testing, and what smart activity exploration actually looks like for students aiming at highly selective schools. Well, Sonam, thank you so much for being here today, making the trip in from Houston. I'm really excited to talk to you, your experience as a IB Plus admissions officer, the work you're doing in Admittedly. And the one thing I want to remind you of on this podcast is that you are beloved by our Admittedly families for being honest and direct and not pulling any punches on our Ask Admittedly and our Admittedly Academies. And that's what we want to hear today, right? So want your honest opinion, want your hot takes. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Thomas.
We talked about your really just stellar resume, your background. Just quickly, what is it that you like about being in admissions?
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading student stories and seeing their narratives come to life. It's a fascinating process to read an application in about 10 minutes and really understand who the student is, where they came from, and what drives them.
Yeah, but okay, so I get a lot of this in the comments, right? How can you possibly distill 17, 18 years of a person's life down into 10 minutes? That just seems unfair.
I think it's a lot is due to the credit of the Common App. And so the way that it's broken up, right? Understanding the background of the student. Here's where I grew up based off my high school, my family. Here's sort of where my parents went to school. If they went to school, it gives us a lot of insight into what your upbringing may or may not have been like, because regional admissions officers understand the region. And then the activities list is a resume ultimately. And so being able to do that well helps the admissions officer understand, okay, I understand the motivations of the student, kind of where they're coming from, what they're interested, and then the essays really where they're going.
Right. And not just the Common App, but also the supplement. And I think students a lot of times don't realize the amount of work that goes into crafting a supplement. From the school side, it's not just a random collection of questions and essays. How important is the supplement in the overall review process?
I think it's actually a lot more important than the personal essay. And I think students really and families sometimes miss that because they put so much emphasis on the 650-word essay.
Yes.
They forget about the supplemental essays until the last minute. But supplemental essays, the questions are often reflections of institutional priorities. So I like to tell families, if you really want to understand what an institution cares about, read their supplemental essay questions very carefully.
Well, what do you mean by institutional priorities? That seems like a very vague, nebulous term.
So each admissions office amongst the highly selective or selective institutions has certain types of students that they're looking for. And often questions are crafted to bring out those values and those experiences from the students so that you can understand what drives them and what motivates them. So for example, if you have the Why Roommate essay at Harvard and Stanford, what they're really trying to understand is, what would you be like as a roommate?
Fair.
It is just that simple. And why is that important? Well, because we want students on our campuses who are going to be good roommates and good stewards in living with each other.
Fair enough. My favorite example of that is the University of Chicago, their main essay, right? And we had a lot of people in the comments, a lot of students complaining about it, right? This is so hard. I don't know what to say. And you're like, yeah, that's the point. A, they're trying to weed you out, but B, they're trying to look for what makes a Chicago student great, which is just like creative, disruptive thought that you can blend with humor and curiosity. So yeah, I love that. But so question for you, right? You talk about the schools looking for different things. I mean, how do you know as an admissions officer what to even look for? Is it just kind of like what your personal feelings are? Is there a training process? How does that work?
No, there is a pretty intense training process. Most admissions officers in their first year, I like to say your first cycle is really you're learning about how to read based off that institution's priorities.
Okay.
And really, an admissions officer doesn't learn and understand the pool of the institution they're reading for until the second or even the third cycle. The first cycle is just getting used to the job.
So as you're getting, you're talking about like getting the feeling and understanding how to read these applications. What are some of the things that you're trained to look for?
It honestly depends on the institution. I think the very first baseline, and something I always remind students of, is the baseline, especially now in the era of independent college consultants, AI helping with essays, the baseline will always be the academics. Can you do the work here? And looking at the transcript, looking at the curriculum rigor, and then now looking at testing a little bit more seriously.
That's a great lead into testing. Why are these schools bringing back standardized testing? We've heard so much that it's privilege bias and it discriminates and it's not a measure of intelligence, it's a measure of effort. So why are we regressing to the bad old days of testing?
The conversation around testing is very nuanced, and we can have a whole podcast episode on that. I think the heart of it, though, ultimately, is it is a standardization. And so during the pandemic, when a lot of schools did go test optional, there was also a rise in grade inflation, right? Parents and teachers were grappling with virtual learning and how do you really grade for that? And students struggled. And so there are a lot of schools now where the lowest grade in the class might be a B.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about that, where a lot of students aren't getting C's and D's anymore, but really just A's and B's, what you're then using standardized testing to do is understand, okay, have you really mastered the material?
Okay.
Right? Even beyond just SAT and ACT and the sections there, but the AP scores or predicted IB scores, especially when we are living in an era where your major is considered a little bit more heavily in the admissions process.
Got it. And a question we get all the time, right? Can a strong standardized test score offset a slip in academics?
It depends.
I know, I'm gonna put you right on the spot with that one.
I think what families have to realize, and I think students have to realize, is the transcript is about pattern recognition. So if you have one off grade, sure, it's not going to be a big deal. But if there's a very clear pattern, an upward grade trend, a downward grade trend as rigor increases, right? Because when rigor increases, it means there's frankly more homework.
Yes.
And so are you able to manage your time well as you get into those AP courses in junior year or the IB diploma?
Right.
Especially those HLs. And so testing can't really overcompensate if the grade pattern is very clearly not all A's, mostly A's, especially at the T25 and T30. And there is a trend, and something we talk a lot about in the admissions process right now on both sides of the desk, is there is a thing called the late bloomer, right? This process is a reflection of maturity to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with being a late bloomer. It just means that perhaps these institutions may not be the right fit in undergrad, but for grad school.
For grad school, exactly. And I think the interesting thing is that there is a pattern, right, that needs to happen. So high school, you have to do well academically, do well in your testing, get involved in extracurricular activities. And if you have any ideas about graduate school, you have to do the same thing in undergrad. And so it's this interesting where we get a lot of families that are like, I don't know why this matters. I don't know why I can't, fall on my face freshman year, do a little bit better sophomore year, then pull it up junior and senior year and not be admitted to a top 10 school. You're like, yeah, but because it says a lot about how you're going to be in the undergrad. And then the undergrad is absolutely, what they look at for your graduate work. So there is a method to this madness, no?
Correct. And I think it's also recognizing that different schools put different weight on freshman year grades as an example.
Right.
So it's pretty open. The UCs say on their website, like they recalculate GPA with sophomore and junior year grades, not freshman year, because they recognize the curve, especially if you go from a smaller middle school here in California to a larger public high school, you're going to have a transition and they give grace over it. Does Harvard have to extend the same grace? No, they don't. And I think that's what really, sometimes the public and students and families aren't aware of is they loop in all of the T30 and think that they all think the same way. And they don't. And they have the right as private institutions that are set, institutional priorities are set by boards and deans and leadership to determine who they want to look for in a given year.
So you keep saying like institutional priorities in schools are different. So if I were an anxious student, what I would probably hear is, what are those institutional priorities so I can direct my application towards those when I apply, because that's my secret to getting in.
I would caution that thinking because institutional priorities can change.
And often do.
And often do. Yes. And I think there are some specific personalities that the T25 institutions have looked for year over year, but they're allowed to change their mind and adapt because ultimately the priorities in a given year is set by the changes in the pool.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's always changing because society is always changing.
Well, and that's what I've tried to explain many times on podcasts, and people have a very hard time sometimes kind of internalizing this, that you have your priorities going in. So you meet, the head of admissions will meet with the dean, they'll meet with the faculty, alumni affairs, and like, okay, what are we looking for? Career management, what do we want? You set your priorities, but you have no idea what's coming in the door until you look at the pool. And there may be institutional priorities that you don't have the depth in the pool to satisfy. So yes, it's a very dangerous thing to kind of target what you think the school is looking for. And also, and I'd love to hear your take on this too, like different admissions officers read things differently, view things differently, look at things differently. And so those committee rooms can get a little bit contentious at times.
They can. And I think, I would say a good admissions officer becomes very protective of their region, right? And they want to obviously admit more applicants from their region. I think sometimes for a long time, we thought of the admissions officer as the gatekeeper. But admissions officers are really also advocates. They want to admit more students from their regions. And so the way when you're sitting in committee, you're really shaped by what you just read in your region, the applications you've read in your region. And I might feel very strongly about a Californian or a Texan or a Floridian. And my colleague in New York might be like, we have stronger in New York. Right? Than we have in Florida or California. And ultimately, and this is ultimately the reality of being an admissions officer, is like you have to do what's best for the institution as a whole.
Yes.
And that's when committee can get really contentious. It's just like any business, right? You have to do what's best for every vertical of the business as a whole, not necessarily just one vertical of the business.
Narrow view, exactly. And it's a zero-sum game, right? And I think one of the things that and I understand this, as students have a hard time accepting sometimes, is that you can be great. You could have done everything right and still not get in, right? And if you'd applied last year, maybe you would get in, or if you applied the next year, you might get in. And so a lot of this is it's not a hard bar where you're like, oh, if you get over this bar, you're in. It's this constant kind of trading and negotiating and back and forth and things shifting and moving in perpetual motion.
This show is brought to you by Early Edge Plus, Admittedly's flagship coaching program for high-achieving students and their families. At Admittedly, we've built a team of former admissions officers from top schools like Wharton, Duke, Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and University of Chicago. We know what actually gets students into top colleges because we've been in the room making those decisions. If you want that insider perspective, visit admittedly.co/apply. That's admittedly.co/apply to book your free family action call with one of our admissions advisors today.
So, Sonam, if you're saying, and I completely agree with this, right, you shouldn't be trying to figure out what the school is looking for and adapt to that because you don't know. But then how do you think about, because there's this universe of schools out there, how do you think about curating an effective school list that matches with what you are looking for?
Yeah, I think one, it's a lot of reflection and honesty with oneself, right? So looking at your grades, looking at your test scores, and then looking at the medians at the schools.
Okay.
And that's like step one. And then in terms of like figuring out the right fit for you, personality wise or academic wise, I always encourage my students, I'm like, talk to people who go there.
Right.
You are allowed to reach out to the admissions office and say, hey, I would love to talk to an admissions ambassador. Or look at, many students go to schools where they have had peers go to these institutions in years prior.
Exactly.
It doesn't hurt you to DM a friend and say, hey, I went to All Saints too, and I'm a current junior. Can I talk to you about your experience at Stanford, at Duke, at Harvard? I'm curious to hear more. 90% of the time, alumni of your high school are not going to say no to you.
Right.
And I think understanding if that's the right fit for you, and then also reflecting on your own values, right? Do you care about school spirit? Do you care about weather? If you have seasonal depression,
don't go to Michigan.
Don't go to Michigan, Chicago, Yale, perhaps. I think that because sometimes students forget this process doesn't end when you get in. This process continues, and you have to then live at these schools for 4 years.
Yes.
And then come out on the other side.
And not just live. I always love hearing from former students that get to an Ivy Plus school and they call me and they're like, oh my God, I'm trying to join this club and I need a resume and fill out an application and interview. Like, what's going on? I'm like, yeah, well, you're in a school now of all type A overachievers. And so you can't have a finance club with 3,000 members. That's not how that works. So yeah, no, welcome to the big leagues. So, no, I love that. And I think, as we're talking about matching and fit and like what matters to you, obviously an important component of this is certainly the academics, right? So you want to look at what, is it a research or a teaching institution? Do you want to be in a class with 20 classmates and a professor, or 600 classmates and a teaching assistant, like how that looks. But another big component of this is life outside the classroom and extracurricular activities. And so let's talk a little bit about how, as an admissions officer, you view extracurricular activities, and then how, as a student, you should be thinking about that as you're crafting your own extracurricular journey.
Yeah. I think ultimately it's remembering that these colleges and universities have 200 clubs and organizations themselves on campus, and they need people to fill that. And they're really looking at your activities list ultimately about understanding what might you do when you come here at X institution. How are you going to be involved on our campus? Because what are all of these 200 clubs and organizations for, if not to be run and led by students?
Yes.
And I think for students, it really is about whatever they do it well. And I think especially in the era of ChatGPT and AI, where you can get a lot of help with your essays, frankly, I do think a lot of admissions officers have the mindset of, do your actions match your words?
Absolutely.
And the evidence of that action comes through the activities list. It comes through in recommendation letters. It comes through in how other people are talking about you. And that is critical to understand, because if there's a mismatch between what you're telling me you want to do and what I'm seeing as your actions, that's a narrative that's not really coming together. And that's where I have a lot of pause as an admissions officer, or would have a lot of pause.
And I think it's interesting. We get a lot of comments about how, like, oh, can't you just fake this part? And can't you just fake that part? And I think what a lot of people miss is the fact that these applications are very deliberately constructed, and you don't see it as an applicant because it's your first time through. But as a reader, you know all the different cross-reference points and where to validate things, and it's extremely hard, if not impossible, to fake an entire application between recommendations, counselor letters, school profiles, extracurricular activities. And so there's a lot of different ways you're going to get tripped up. And it's not always that you need proof of that. It's that gut feeling, that Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hour, you know something's wrong. You're not sure what it is. You don't have time to figure it out.
Right, agreed. And I think even now with the rise of the video supplementals, right? The Glimpse, the Viva interview that Caltech has launched on research, the alumni interview, right? If you are saying that you started X and your alumni interview decides to push you and ask you about it and you fumble and can't really answer.
Yeah.
That's evidence that perhaps it wasn't as big of an impact as you made it seem in your application. Right. And so I think admissions officers are very trained to look at the details.
Yes.
Because ultimately you are splitting hairs amongst students who are very academically capable.
Yes, exactly. But okay, so that's a great question. We get a lot in the comments as well. So why isn't this just a raw meritocracy, academics only, like England or China?
Because there's 25,000 high schools, and if it was academics only and you only admitted valedictorians at each of the 25,000 high schools, there still would not be enough spots for all of them at the T10.
Love it.
Academic performance and test scores have become increasingly important in today's admissions landscape. That's why Admittedly is partnered with Advantage Testing, the nation's #1 private tutoring company. For nearly 40 years, their Ivy League tutors have helped students perform their very best. Help your student get an advantage and learn more at admittedly.co/testing. That's admittedly.co/testing.
And so when you think about extracurricular activities, right? And people know how I feel about passion projects. I hate them. Let's go two ways. Number one, what are some really memorable extracurricular activities that you've seen where people have had courage and kind of stepped out of the traditional path? And then also, where have you seen students be successful where they've only done activities at school because they're limited in some way and that's their only opportunity?
I'll do the second part first.
Great.
And I'll use myself as an example. So I grew up in a very small island in the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, and there wasn't a lot of opportunities outside of the high school. But I still ventured out of my comfort zone and did things over the summer in the continental U.S. I joined territorial chapters for the Junior Statesmen of America, which no longer exists, but did 15 years ago. And then when there were new opportunities in the territory, like the Virgin Islands History Bowl, I joined. And there are those small, and then I had faith, and I think this is what a lot of students forget, is like your regional admissions officer's job in part is to understand the region. And so I had a lot of faith that I wouldn't be compared to a student in New York City who has all of these opportunities available to them, but that I took advantage of those directly around me.
Okay.
And then in terms of the most memorable activities, I think it's when I see students who are like, we didn't have X and I really saw a need for it. So for example, maybe a student at the border of Texas is saying that they see a need for migrants to get translation services on their legal documents. And so, they and their classmates, they all speak Spanish and English. They started a group to help them translate and talk to lawyers. That to me is like, okay, I saw a problem in my community and I did something about it. And then the other thing I like to see is like, when you're trained as an admissions officer, that you're reading the application of a 17-year-old. And so it is always nice to see, well, what do you do in your free time?
Yes.
And sometimes that can come out in your activities list because maybe you took a hobby and extended it to your peers, right? So you're very into surfing as an example.
Right.
You started a surf club. Cool.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to relate to necessarily your academic interests, but maybe it does, right? Maybe you're a marine bio major.
Exactly.
And surfing is your thing. And that makes a lot of sense to me that, you would have an academic interest ultimately born out of your hobbies too.
Yeah. We had a student last night on Ask Admittedly saying basically like, I love ballet, I love dance, it's very integral to who I am. I'm at a very high level, but I also love the law, and I'm wrestling with a way to integrate that. I was like, well, you could certainly talk about like artist representation and, legal issues within the performing arts world, but you can also just say dance is for me. It's like where I am happiest, where I'm freest, where I'm allowed to just disengage my mind and be my own true self. But I also do fundraising and mentorship and teaching like other values, but they don't have to be, not everything has to be perfectly aligned. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it is. And I remind students that the Common App is 10 activities,
Right.
right? There's not an admissions officer, I think, on the planet or former admissions officer who expects all 10 of your activities, or let's say with the UC application, 15 of them to be all aligned to your major interest.
Right.
And in fact, sometimes I'm like, if I see that, I'm a little bit like, when did you explore? And then I also start to wonder, I'm like, did you have outside help? Like, these things can get really nuanced, but most kids do need that exploration phase, right? Especially in grades 9, 10, grades 8. And so when I look at an activities list, often what I tell families is I'm like, okay, here's the first page. This is where you clearly start to narrow in on your passions, grade 11 and 12, because you reflected on what's important to you. But the second page of the Common App, activities 6 through 10, is often where you will see a little bit of exploration.
Right.
And that's very normal. We don't expect students, there's not a single admissions officer that expects a student to know exactly what they want to do in grade 9. It's nice if you've really identified your passions early on.
Yeah, some of those students do. But certainly, yeah, no admissions officer is looking at a ninth grader and being like, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? Okay. One question I do want to ask, because everybody knows that admissions officers thrive off the tears and broken dreams of people applying, right? You only take this job if you enjoy inflicting pain and suffering. Tell us about, is that true?
No, it's not true. Admissions officers really are very student-centric.
Yeah.
They are advocates. They really do want to admit more students from their regions or just from throughout the world to the institution. Many times admissions officers are alum of the institution, so they're deeply passionate about expanding access and opportunity to others for the institution. I think admissions officers have, frankly, a harder job than college counselors. They have to say no a lot, and they get used to saying no a lot. But that doesn't mean that they're, crushing your hopes and dreams. They are doing the best that they can given the frameworks that they have to work within.
Exactly. And I think back to my time running admissions, and people would say, oh, admissions day is your happiest day, right? But it's not, because all you yes, it's fun. You start the morning off making phone calls, you're welcoming people, it's exciting, but then you have to deal with the fallout of all those amazing people that you had literally in the class, out of the class, in the class, out of the class, and finally they ended up out of the class, and you just it breaks your heart. So yeah, no, I know that. I do have a question for you. You talk about regional reps and representing the regions. What do you do and should you be concerned if your high school doesn't have a regional rep that visits it, right? They always visit the school down the road. They always draw heavily from that. Mm-hmm. How do you get on their radar? How do you show them that I deserve to be there?
I think, well, for some schools, that is not necessarily the task. Is your application should do that work for you, okay, right? So crafting the application correctly or well to represent your values is important. Mm-hmm. But I think you have to pay attention to, if they're not coming to my high school, are they doing something in the region, in the area? So they might have an info session at night in a hotel in the area. Mm-hmm. Do you see that on their website so that you can understand more about the institution? Did you attend a virtual info session now post-pandemic? There's so many opportunities to engage with the institution, even if they don't come to your high school. What I do want to say, and I get a lot of feedback here of so-and-so institution hates my school because they never come. Well, even where they go often is dictated by, where they're getting applications from, who's ultimately yielding. Like, there is data analysis happening in admissions offices. And so again, it's not a reflection of the high school, or if the institution hates the high school,
Correct.
but rather, the directive that an admissions officer may have been given from their dean or director.
Right. And a lot of times admissions officers travel in groups. And so it's kind of this negotiated, like, well, let's go to these schools, and you develop long friendships over the years, which is a fun part of it.
That's correct. For a long time, Duke was and is part of Exploring College Options, which was a consortium that traveled together for 30 years with Duke, Penn, Georgetown, Stanford, and Harvard.
Yeah.
And so those five admissions officers especially spent a lot of time for 30 years getting to know each other.
Yeah. Great. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your wisdom. You have so much more wisdom to share, and definitely be doing that going forward through Admittedly. So please keep an eye on our socials at AdmittedlyCo. That's at AdmittedlyCo on Instagram and TikTok. If you want to see more of Sonam, obviously I'll be coming to you on a very regular basis. Please be sure to keep an eye out for our monthly free webinars. We have frequent guests now. Sonam was on the last one, and she's going to be appearing more and more in the future. And thank you very much for following the podcast. It means a lot. I love, by the way, the interaction. So please come to our social media. Please go to YouTube, hit subscribe. It means a lot to us. It makes a big difference. And drop your comments in there. I am in the comments every single day, much to the chagrin of my entire family. It's something where I love interacting with you. I love answering your questions. We have a whole team. I'm in the DMs as well. So interact with us. We love to hear from you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Please take a moment to subscribe to the Admittedly podcast and download this episode. I welcome you to share your thoughts and questions with me. You can find us on social media at Admittedly Podcast. I look forward